When I was 25, I became the target of my pastor, who was significantly older. He's even older than my father. He was supposed to be my spiritual guide, but he used the information I shared during a therapy session against me. I married my husband at a very young age, before turning 18. We had a strong relationship, and now he's 29 years old. We've faced many challenges together, and I deeply love him. However, I began to feel that he was increasingly focused on his work and emotionally distant. Before making any judgments, let me provide some context to help you understand how this affair unfolded. I was 17 when I married my husband, and he was 21. My parents vehemently opposed our marriage. First, they believed I was too young for him, and then they argued that I hadn't even finished high school. They had set up a college fund for me when I was just 5 years old, with plans for me to attend college. However, in my youthful defiance, I believed I knew better. At that tender age, like many rebellious teenagers of the time, I ran away from home to marry my now husband. At the time, he was part of a boy band. He convinced me that he had a promising future, that he was on the path to becoming a rock star, and that he was at the early stages of superstardom. They would go on tours, and in my teenage mind, having 300 to 500 people show up seemed incredibly impressive. 2 months after I left home, I discovered I was pregnant. I had just turned 18 and was about to become a mother while on the road with a group of aspiring rock stars. The glamorous rock star dream quickly faded, and we had to mature rapidly. I realized that my husband's band wasn't as talented as I had thought. In fact, they were quite terrible. They barely made enough money from concerts because they had to split their earnings with other bands on tour with them. They couldn't draw large crowds on their own. Eventually, the band disbanded because pursuing music wasn't generating enough income to support a decent living. As I mentioned earlier, we had to mature quickly and face financial struggles. We resorted to panhandling and hitchhiking until we welcomed our second child. It became evident to my husband that he needed stable employment, and we needed to find a permanent place to settle down since all the constant traveling wasn't suitable for our children. During this time, I didn't have a good relationship with my parents. Although my parents would have been willing to help, especially for the sake of their grandchildren, I was too proud to seek their assistance. Additionally, their help often came with strict conditions. My parents are devout Pentecostals who practice speaking in tongues and hold conservative beliefs, including viewing premarital sex as a grave sin. This perspective is shared by many Christians. I grew up in a household where we attended church daily, prayed regularly, and had scriptures read to us by our parents. Living under their strict and controlling rules made me envious of children with more lenient parents. When I met my now husband, I saw an opportunity to break free from my rigid upbringing. So, while the option to seek help from my parents was available, I didn't want to return to them as a failure. I wanted to avoid being seen as the prodigal daughter and didn't want them to think they had been right all along. On the other hand, my husband had a different upbringing. He grew up in a halfway home and had no knowledge of his biological parents. From a young age, he displayed great passion and dedication to whatever he pursued. In his early teens, he gathered some neighborhood kids to form a band, partly to keep out of trouble. I admired his dedication, and at the time, they seemed cool and garnered attention from girls, which made me feel special. However, they didn't possess the talent to make it to the big leagues. When it became evident that touring wasn't generating enough income, we made the decision to settle down in one city. My husband frequently moved between temporary jobs while I took care of our children. Fortunately, he had completed high school, allowing him to secure minimum wage jobs easily. In contrast, I had not finished high school. In reality, I was in the final stretch of my high school education when I decided to run away with my husband. At that point, I lacked any marketable skills, which made me deeply regret not completing high school or pursuing a college education, especially because I had been an excellent student during my time in school. It seems that my rebellious nature took over. I felt like I was missing out on something, craving adventure, and desiring to explore the world. Ultimately, my parents' advice proved to be accurate. My 2 younger siblings had returned home and were thriving. I stayed in touch with my younger siblings. During this period, I had 3 children, making life incredibly challenging. We could hardly afford a place to live, so we constantly moved from one motel to another, and sometimes we even resorted to sleeping under bridges when we ran out of money. Our surroundings were filled with numerous homeless individuals, people struggling with mental health issues, and pills users. Unfortunately, my husband also got involved in pills use, and our relationship was marred by constant fights and arguments about money. I desperately wanted him to step up and earn more money. I urged him to find a job so that we could live in an apartment and escape the misery we were enduring. I couldn't bear to see my children go hungry or lack basic necessities. We became so destitute that I even contemplated engaging in sex work, but my husband strongly opposed it. Nonetheless, the sight of my children suffering due to hunger and homelessness led me to secretly turn to sex work behind my husband's back. I only stopped after I experienced a horrifying incident in which a customer not only refused to pay, but also brandished an arm, brutally attacked me, and left me severely injured and robbed. The trauma from this ordeal continues to haunt me to this day. Strangers found me in a pool of blood and rushed me to the hospital. I was too afraid to share the full truth with my boyfriend at the time. I simply told him I had been robbed. After being discharged from the hospital, we had no choice but to rely on shelters and food pantries throughout the town, which provided some relief. We reached a point of desperation and decided to seek assistance from a Pentecostal church. Having grown up in a Pentecostal church myself, I knew exactly how to gain their trust and sympathy by saying and doing the right things. We were offered a deal by the church. In exchange for their support, we would attend church activities, help with cleaning, and serve as ushers during services. It wasn't a mandatory condition. We understood it as an opportunity to rebuild our lives and draw closer to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. With the church's assistance, my husband pursued a 2-year programming degree. After graduating, he secured a job at a startup company, and our financial situation improved. We became self-sufficient, no longer reliant on the church's support, and could finally afford to rent an apartment. This marked the first time I had a stable place to call home, free from the constant need to move every week. It was a significant improvement for both me and my children. Our lives seemed to be on an upward trajectory, but it came at the cost of my husband dedicating long hours to work. There were times when he spent up to 15 hours at the office and then brought his work home. I was 23 years old at the time and a mother of 3. My daily routine revolved around attending church, organizing church programs and services, and babysitting for fellow church members. This was far from the life I had envisioned for myself. I had once imagined marrying a rock star, traveling the world, having children in my 30s, and settling down. My husband, who used to be the long-haired, rebellious, pot-smoking bad boy, had transformed into a clean-cut computer nerd. Our affection for each other waned as he devoted most of his time to his job. Our conversations revolved around his work and ongoing projects, as well as his plans to increase his income. I was genuinely happy for his success. Seeing that he had found something he excelled at, was appreciated by his employer, and rapidly climbed the salary ladder, reaching a 6-figure income. Our life story was one of rising from the bottom to the top, and I finally had the opportunity to prove my parents wrong. I took pride in my husband's achievements, but deep down, I still felt unfulfilled. Approximately 5 years later, I became more actively involved in the church, hosting services, and occasionally teaching Bible studies. To supplement our income, I decided to open a daycare business on the side. This was partly to keep myself occupied because my husband's income had grown significantly. With more money came more work commitments, which left him little time for anything else. He became completely engrossed in his job, and I started to feel increasingly alone. Our relationship felt more like that of roommates, and there were periods when we went without intimacy for weeks. Initially, I suspected he might be cheating or leading a double life, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. Fast forward to when I was 26 years old. My husband's income had improved, and our family was more financially stable than ever. However, I still carried the heavy burden of the traumatic assault and the weight of postnatal depression, which left me feeling constantly depressed, unhappy, and isolated. To cope, I focused my attention on my children, but my mental health started to deteriorate, leading to weight gain. We decided to move to a better neighborhood in a different part of town and joined a new church. While I became actively engaged in church activities, my husband was less involved, attending services only every other Sunday. We both recognized that our marriage was struggling and decided to take proactive steps to improve it. Knowing that our church offered marriage counseling, I suggested that we attend sessions together. Although my husband initially believed our marriage was fine, he agreed to it because he saw how much it meant to me. Our senior pastor, who was known for his wisdom and deep knowledge of Scripture, conducted the counseling sessions. He was quite busy, and many sought his guidance. During our first session on a Monday evening, he focused on understanding our relationship dynamics. His ability to make us feel at ease and open up was remarkable, and within our 45-minute session, he helped break down our defenses. In that first session, he recommended that we dedicate more time to discussing our relationship and enjoying quality time together without the distractions of work or our children. He also provided practical communication techniques to help us improve our relationship. He also suggested that taking vacations would be a great idea, something I had previously recommended to my husband, but he had always been putting it off. Our next counseling session was set for 2 weeks later. When we returned home, we put into practice much of what he had taught us, and we were able to significantly enhance our communication in a short period. However, there was still room for improvement. 2 weeks later, my husband was in the midst of a product launch, making it impossible for him to attend the counseling session. I called in advance to inform them, and the pastor's personal assistant contacted me later, stating that the pastor would like to see me for an individual counseling session, and that I should come even without my husband. I remember arriving at his office 20 minutes early, and he was counseling another couple. I waited in the lobby until it was my turn. When I entered his office, I apologized for my husband's absence, but he reassured me and asked me to take a seat on the couch. Our conversation began with discussions about my relationship with my husband and the improvements we had made so far. It then shifted toward personal hobbies and what I enjoyed doing for fun, among other topics. He offered some flattering compliments, but nothing inappropriate, which I appreciated. He began sharing his own life experiences and accomplishments, making it feel like a casual chat between friends. Only a few minutes of our conversation in the beginning were about my relationship. The rest involved getting to know each other, sharing personal stories, and sharing some laughs. I wasn't particularly attracted to him, but I felt comfortable in his presence. I felt like I could speak openly without fear of judgment, ask any question, and receive thoughtful responses. For the first time since my traumatic assault, I revealed the true details to him, sharing my experiences that I had never disclosed to anyone, not even my husband. It was refreshing to feel like I was conversing with a mature adult. Our counseling session went beyond the scheduled time, and another couple was waiting for their turn in the adjacent area. His secretary knocked on the door to inform him that the next couple was ready. Instead of scheduling another session with my husband, we arranged for another individual counseling session. I didn't question why this change occurred. When he suggested individual counseling instead of the original plan of couples counseling aimed at strengthening our relationship and improving our communication, I had a feeling that something wasn't right. It seemed like things were veering off course, but I trusted his expertise and experience, assuming he knew what was best. I enjoyed his company and found him fascinating. When I got home, my husband was a bit surprised that we didn't cancel the session. I explained that the pastor believed there were things I needed to work through. I knew this wasn't entirely true, but my husband was relieved he didn't have to attend. Maybe it was because I had initially pushed for counseling, and he was just trying to appease me. Although the pastor had been at the church since I started attending, I had never really noticed or viewed him differently before our marriage counseling sessions. The next session was scheduled for the following week, which raised my suspicions since counseling was typically held bi-weekly due to his busy schedule. Even his personal assistant mentioned in passing that weekly counseling was rare and I must be fortunate. I took it as a sign that my situation must be quite serious. I wasn't sure how to react, but I smiled, feeling grateful that someone cared enough to dedicate their time to me. On the Sunday before the individual counseling, the pastor delivered a sermon. I can't recall the topic of the sermon, but I do remember my feelings at that moment. I felt a sense of pride and admiration for him, even though it might sound absurd. It was akin to knowing a celebrity, and seeing him at the pulpit that day gave me a newfound appreciation for him. He doesn't strike me as particularly good-looking or impressive. He was in his mid-50s with gray hair, physically fit, standing at about 5 feet 8 inches. Not as striking as my husband, who's 6 feet 1 inch, but he had a knack for dressing impeccably. All his outfits were crisp and meticulously ironed, with great attention to detail. I had heard several sermons from this pastor before, but that Sunday he seemed more charismatic than I remembered. While I wouldn't go so far as to compare him to a rock star on the altar, it came close. I started to understand why people thought so highly of him. Perhaps that's why the secretary mentioned that I was fortunate to have an individual counseling session with him scheduled so soon. I felt lucky to have another opportunity to see him. I couldn't explain why I felt this way. Naively, I believed he had a fatherly affection for me, and I had little control over my emotions. I thought that maybe my feelings were a result of never appearing vulnerable to another man aside from my husband. I had shared my darkest trauma with him, something I couldn't bring myself to do with my husband. The day before the individual counseling, I felt anxious and apprehensive. I entertained the idea that maybe I had a secret crush on him, which was embarrassing. He might not feel the same way, and I might be misinterpreting everything. Furthermore, we were both married, which alone felt like a sin. I knew I should put a stop to it before it went any further, but a part of me wanted to explore these feelings. I convinced myself it was just a passing infatuation that would fade as I got to know him better. On the day of the counseling, which I believe was a Monday, I was so nervous that I considered canceling. However, I mustered enough courage to attend despite my anxiety. Similar to the previous session, this session consisted of a casual conversation about our lives, but this time we avoided any mention of my husband. I sat across from him, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a therapy session. The next 2 sessions followed a similar pattern, with us growing increasingly comfortable with each other. When my husband asked about the sessions, I would tell him they were going well. I was feeling positive about my marriage at that point, believing I had found an outlet. I treated my husband better, refrained from nagging as he had complained about, and our fights became less frequent. It was like I had found another avenue to explore what was missing in my relationship. The next session was scheduled for the late evening, around 8 p.m., after the evening service. I found the timing unusual because it didn't align with our typical counseling days, and the front office secretary was absent. However, I felt so comfortable that I didn't mind. I thought I might be coming down with a cold, so I wore a turtleneck sweater. Upon entering his office, he noticed that I appeared chilly. He seized the opportunity to sit closer to me and inquired about how I was feeling. I mentioned that I felt like my temperature might be rising. He moved closer, and I could sense his presence. Then he gently placed the back of his hand on my neck to check my temperature. I felt a shiver when he touched my cheek, which startled me. He quickly withdrew his hand from the side of my neck and commented that my temperature seemed normal. Since I was convinced my temperature was rising, I took his hand and pressed it against the same spot to convince him otherwise. By this point, we were very close, and the tension was palpable. Before I could say anything, he leaned in and attempted to kiss me on the lips. In response, I turned my face away, exposing the side of my neck. He began kissing my neck and then moved down to my cleavage. I was so shocked and frozen that I didn't react. I just let him continue. I remained motionless as he lifted his head and attempted to kiss me. I resisted a bit, but we continued, and he began touching me for what felt like an eternity. I wanted it to be over, so I allowed him to do as he pleased. He reached down, trying to use his fingers, but I resisted. He also tried to unbutton my clothing, but I wouldn't let him, so we just kissed. Eventually, I began to pull away slowly. My senses were returning, and a growing sense of guilt washed over me. I felt like things had escalated too quickly. With my face turned down, I pushed him away slightly and told him we couldn't continue. I stood up from the couch without looking back and left his office. I went home that day burdened with guilt over what had occurred. I believed I had committed a grave sin, and I even blamed myself, thinking that I had tempted him and led a man of God to sin. I was so depressed that I avoided going to church for 2 weeks. My husband noticed my state, but I didn't tell him the truth. I was afraid of the consequences and didn't know how he would react, so I kept it hidden. After 2 weeks, I began to feel better. The depression lifted, and the guilt began to subside. I started getting back to my normal routine and felt less ashamed of the incident. Then, one day, I received a call from an unfamiliar number, and it turned out to be my pastor's private phone number. It had been 3 weeks since he had tried to force himself on me. I was surprised that it was him, although maybe I shouldn't have been. He apologized for what had happened, acknowledging it as a sin and emphasizing that he was not above it. He mentioned that it had happened in the heat of the moment, but that didn't excuse it. He urged me not to stop attending church because of the incident. During his apology, I felt naive, or perhaps overwhelmed and uncomfortable. I kept saying, "No, it's okay," as if I were apologizing as well. In that awkward conversation, I felt compelled to agree with him and say yes to everything he was saying. Even though internally, I didn't feel in alignment with him. It seemed like the easiest way to make him go away. During the phone call, as he attempted to persuade me to return to the church, he mentioned the option of canceling the individual counseling session to alleviate any concerns I might have. Strangely, I responded with, No, it's okay." I felt like I was on autopilot, simply agreeing with whatever he said. Once the call ended, I almost threw the phone on the floor in disbelief. I couldn't believe I had agreed to go back to the church, let alone another counseling session. In hindsight, the best course of action would have been to avoid returning and block his number. However, I'm the type of person who always keeps their promises, and I still held a great deal of respect and admiration for him. I was afraid of offending or disappointing him. Despite knowing that I might be putting myself in a situation ripe for temptation, I went along with it anyway. On Sunday, I took a seat at the back of the church. It was a moderately large church, with around 1,500 to 1,600 members, and I hoped I could blend into the crowd, hoping no one would notice me. But that wasn't the case. After the service, just as I was about to leave, an usher approached me and informed me that the pastor wanted to see me. I made my way to the pastor's office. There were other church members there as well, waiting for their turn to speak with him, so I patiently waited for my opportunity. When it was finally my turn, he greeted me with his charming manner, appearing genuinely pleased to see me. A few minutes into our conversation, I began to feel at ease. It was as if all had been forgiven and forgotten, almost as if the sexual encounter had never happened. We arranged for another meeting, and he didn't pretend it was merely a counseling session. It felt odd, almost like a date of sorts. Considering how busy and authoritative he appeared, with people gathered outside his office waiting to speak with him, I felt privileged that he had made time in his day to see me. The counseling session took place in the evening once again, like a recurring nightmare that I had willingly entered into. Just like before, the secretary was absent. As soon as I entered, he greeted me with a hug, ensuring that our cheeks brushed against each other. He attempted to kiss me on the lips, and I allowed it. Things escalated from kissing to him gradually removing my clothes. One thing led to another, and I found myself on his couch, wearing only my underwear. He persuaded me to remove them as well, and we engaged in sexual activity on his office sofa. Following that, he made me promise to see him again. I left his office that day overwhelmed by guilt, feeling dirty, as if I had returned to the days when I engaged in secret activities behind my husband's back. I was in an internal struggle. On one hand, I could have said no and exposed him, but on the other, I felt like a robot controlled by a puppeteer, with my pastor as the puppeteer. We continued to meet in his church office and sometimes at a hotel to avoid arousing suspicion. He orchestrated all the moves and arrangements, relishing being in control. I simply went along with it. Oddly enough, I felt like my relationship with my husband was improving because I wasn't demanding much from him. He noticed the change and was pleased, though he didn't know the real reason behind it. I couldn't help but feel guilty. I struggled to reconcile my conscience, attempting to justify my relationship with my pastor while remaining a devout believer. It became increasingly challenging when my spiritual leader was the one pushing me to sin. He continued to preach against the very things we were doing after the church service, It impacts me deeply, especially when I see his wife by his side, along with his 2 kids who are older than me. He continues to comfortably preach every Sunday and Wednesday in front of his faithful congregation. At that time, a part of me felt like he was a fraud and a skilled manipulator, but I was still entangled in the affair. By this point, the affair had been ongoing for about 4 months. He introduced me to various erotic experiences, some of which were unconventional and provocative. I'm not someone who watches X content or derives pleasure from observing others engage in intimate interaction, so my knowledge of intimate positions was limited to the basic styles. My husband had attempted to encourage me to explore new things in the bedroom, but I hadn't always been receptive due to the trauma from our past when we were homeless. However, I had engaged in activities with the pastor that my husband had desired, but I had declined. This made me feel even guiltier. And strangely, I began to feel like I was cheating on the pastor with my husband. My affair exposed the extent of the dullness in my sexual relationship with my husband. Regrettably, I felt dominated by the pastor, even though I knew deep down that he was using me. I felt guilty for trying new things with a man I didn't love and had no intention of being with, while neglecting my husband's desires. It haunted me to the point where I forced myself to start exploring new experiences with my husband after years of rejecting his advances. What I came to realize during my time with the pastor was that I had been selfish in our intimate moments, placing blame on him for my past trauma, our previous homelessness, and unconsciously holding these issues over his head. Intimacy with him was solely for my pleasure, and I didn't consider his needs much. I couldn't allow myself to truly enjoy intimacy with him after my assault. However, once I began the affair with the pastor, guilt crept in, and I consciously decided to spice things up with my husband. I wanted to try some of the adventurous acts I had engaged in with the pastor to alleviate the guilt of the affair. One evening, when my husband returned from work, I surprised him by preparing a bath for both of us, something I had never done before. I initiated intimate moments and tried new things in the bath. It felt like a fresh experience for us, and my husband was pleasantly surprised. He asked why I suddenly became so adventurous, and I explained that I was simply exploring new things. He made a joking comment, suggesting that maybe I learned it in therapy. I reacted defensively and we got into an argument. He apologized, but he clearly took note of my strong reaction. His comment alarmed me, and I began to realize the risks involved in the affair with my pastor. I started contemplating the consequences if my husband were to discover the truth. I became paranoid, even suspecting that he might be testing me, pretending not to know something. The following morning, as my husband left for work, I was still shaken by his comment from the previous night. I suspected he might be onto something, and I panicked, setting off a chain of events that would turn my life upside down. I texted the pastor, expressing my fear that my husband was suspicious of us. In my messages, I shared detailed information, which was a mistake that would later come back to haunt me. The pastor called me and insisted on an immediate in-person meeting because he didn't want to discuss such matters over text or phone calls. We met at a restaurant outside of town. The pastor typically disguised himself, and for some reason I felt nervous about the meeting. I had a desire to end the affair, but I feared his reaction because he had become increasingly controlling. To be cautious, I downloaded an app to record our conversation. He arrived early and was sipping coffee when I got there. My recording was on, and the first thing he asked was how my husband had found out. I told him that I wasn't sure if my husband truly knew or if he was playing mind games. I informed him that we needed to stop seeing each other because I was anxious about getting caught. He replied, "Is that all?" I affirmed, and he advised me not to rush to judgment or panic. He suggested that I refrain from texting or calling with my phone and offered to buy me a burner phone for our communication. I expressed my frustration, feeling that he wasn't truly understanding my concerns. I explained my desire to end our relationship because I feared my husband might discover it. I questioned why he didn't share my level of concern, considering that he had more to lose than I did. He claimed to understand, but said he loved me deeply, which struck me as irrational. I didn't love him. I viewed him as a mistake and a predator who took advantage of my emotions and vulnerabilities. He had been an escape from my ordinary life and a seemingly all-knowing adult. I was alarmed, realizing that we had reached different conclusions after our meeting. He wanted to proceed cautiously to prevent discovery, while I had already decided to end it. The following day, a FedEx driver delivered a package requiring a signature, which turned out to be the burner phone sent by my pastor. I found it absurd and risky, feeling that he was using it as another means of control. I initially considered throwing the phone away but changed my mind at the last moment. Our usual meeting day arrived, but I didn't show up. He called me and I answered. He inquired about my absence and why I hadn't used the burner phone. I firmly stated that I no longer wanted to continue our relationship. He began pressuring me, insisting that we needed to discuss this in person. I conveyed to him that his neediness was unattractive, and we were taking too many risks, which was a compelling reason to end our relationship. Following that phone call, I didn't hear from him for a considerable time. I dedicated myself to improving my relationship with my husband, and for a while it went well. We stopped quarreling, and I deliberately worked on how I treated him. In the bedroom, I encouraged him to take control without seeking permission, which took some adjustment for him. He even reduced his work hours to spend more time with me and the kids. This positive phase continued, but it didn't feel entirely natural to him. After a few months had passed since I last saw the pastor and stopped attending that church, about 2 to 3 months, I began searching for a new church for myself and the children. Our previous church members inquired about our absence, and I informed them that we were planning to relocate. Even my husband found my abrupt cessation of church attendance and therapy unusual. We found a new church and began attending regularly. Things seemed to stabilize, and my children were content with the new church. My husband, who wasn't a frequent churchgoer, only joined us once in a while as he preferred watching football on Sundays. Our intimacy returned to its previous state, and I reverted to my old self, gaining some weight, sinking into depression, and feeling the pangs of loneliness creeping in. I made the decision to seek help from a licensed therapist this time around, and I found a female therapist. Initially, I tried to make it a couples therapy by inviting my husband to join, but he declined. I attended only 4 sessions before deciding it wasn't effective for me. One Sunday, I made the mistake of returning to my former church. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I went back. Perhaps I wanted to reconnect with my fellow church members, or maybe even see the pastor again. It's possible I longed for the life I had just a few months earlier because I was beginning to feel miserable. After the church service, some members who recognized me after my long absence gathered around to chat and catch up. The pastor, too, noticed me amid the commotion. At first, he was curious about my presence and asked if I could come to his office for a conversation, which I did. Although many people were waiting to meet him, I was brought to his office ahead of others. He inquired about how I was doing without pressing me on why I had left or why I had returned. He assumed I had come to see him and acted genuinely concerned about my well-being. He asked if I wanted to meet with him again, and though I didn't say much, he scheduled another meeting, and I agreed. That's how we resumed our meetings, although less frequently this time, only once a week. We chose different meeting spots, opting for hotels and sometimes parking lots rather than the church office. I made a point of avoiding his church and remained committed to my new home church. About 2 months into our renewed affair, he unexpectedly canceled one day, explaining that things weren't going well for him and promising to talk later. He sounded unusual, but I didn't think much of it. The following day, my husband returned from work, holding a local newspaper with a headline story about the pastor. Apparently, multiple women from his church had come forward to reveal their ongoing affairs with him to the newspaper. The article also mentioned the possibility of several other women who hadn't yet stepped forward. Discovering that I was just one among many women was a devastating blow to my self-esteem. He had been involved with several other women, not just me. One of the women claimed their affair had been going on for years, while another stated it was more recent. They also mentioned filing a lawsuit against him, all during the height of the #MeToo movement. My husband confronted me about the situation, expressing his suspicion that I might be involved with the pastor as well, given the therapy sessions and the similarity of my story to those of the other women who were coming forward. It didn't take him much time to make the connection, and he wanted me to confess, but I initially denied it. I believed he wouldn't be able to prove it, but I was mistaken. Somehow he managed to recover all the text messages I had deleted from my phone, though I couldn't fathom how. The evidence was undeniable. I eventually admitted to the affair, but attempted to make him believe that he had forced himself on me. However, it was challenging to convince him otherwise, given the frequency of our calls and the recovered deleted messages. Furthermore, He argued that I should have informed him about it, and regardless, I was guilty of cheating. I made my first attempt to explain the assault I had endured while we were homeless, and the actual truth of what occurred, but he refused to believe me. It felt like he didn't care about me, and I knew that his departure would be devastating for me and my children. I begged for forgiveness, but he stunned me by stating that our relationship had been over for a while. He accurately linked the duration of the affair to our deteriorating relationship. I felt ashamed and devastated by the impact on my husband and the destruction of my family. He left home that day and was absent for 2 days. The next day, he informed me that we were separating and advised me to hire a lawyer. My husband earned a significant income, while I was unemployed at the time. According to the separation agreement, I would have primary custody of the children, receive some alimony, and he allowed me to keep the family home for the sake of our kids. I deeply regret my actions, and I truly wish my husband could understand that I was manipulated by a predator. It was never my intention to engage in an affair with that awful man. What's most painful is that this pastor behaved like a despicable person and exploited multiple vulnerable women who sought his help. He used me for his own desires, just as he did with those other women. It's impossible to know how many women he took advantage of, both within the church and elsewhere. I'd like to believe I was a victim because he manipulated me, leading to the loss of the love of my life and the separation of my family. My anger escalated when I found out that he faced minimal consequences. Sadly, the court dismissed the case brought against him by those women, as it was considered consensual. To make matters worse, he openly admitted to the affairs and confessed his sins in front of the congregation. The church elders placed him and his wife on a 120-day paid leave and mandated them to attend marriage counseling twice a week. He will eventually return as the lead pastor after the suspension. The young women involved were not publicly identified, but most members knew who they were. They were not offered counseling and permanently left the church. It appears they were unfairly blamed. Since I no longer attend the church, I'm unsure if they were aware that he preyed on me as well. However, I spoke to a friend who still goes to the church, and she provided me with all the details. I strongly believe that this pastor deserves a special place in hell for what he did to me. Most importantly, it has deeply affected my faith. I'm currently separated from my husband, and the divorce is pending. I still hope he will reconsider and that we can reconcile, as we've overcome even worse challenges together.